Greetings, everyone. Please confirm if I am visible to you, if my screen is shared, and also if my audio is properly audible to you. All right, great. So let's get started. So I wholeheartedly welcome you all to the Google Developer Student Club of Rajasthan College of Engineering for Women's webinar today on the open source. So today we will be introducing you to the open source softwares about, we'll be talking about all of their functionalities and also about some Google's amazing open source software programs that you must participate in being university students. So yeah, let's get started. The first thing is, what exactly is an open source software? So an open source software is a term that you must have heard about a lot. You must have heard about it maybe in our school or maybe in your curriculum, but I really wanted to give a deeper insight into it, about its licensing, how it can be used in business, because we being the developers must have a fair idea of what is the real world use of our applications. So if you are helping to develop an open source application and you do not know the use case of that application, then I think it's not a good thing, right? So just to give you guys a good idea of how it's used in to eradicate the real world problems and how people view it in terms of their business models, I think it will give you better insight to develop things in much better manner. So let's get started. So an open source software is a computer software that has a source code available to the general public for the use as it is, or maybe with some sort of modifications. So this software typically do not require a license fee. So this software is basically free of cost. It does not require any fees for the license, and you're given the source code. You can use it, modify it, share it, and do whatever with it. It's open for your use and modification as a developer. So you're given the code. You are not restricted to only use the application, but you are allowed to even use the source code itself. Okay, so there are open source software applications of a variety of different uses. For example, we have for office automation, web designing, content management, operating systems, and communications. So in contrast, the creators of proprietary software usually do not make their source code available for the others to modify. You also must have heard about proprietary softwares, right? But again, let's get a deeper insight into what exactly is the difference between the open source and the proprietary softwares. So a source code is a specialized language that allows software developers to create and modify the computer programs. If you do not have legal access to the source code, then the program cannot be changed or it cannot be moved to a different kind of computer, right? So proprietary software is more of a commercial software, wherein that application itself is a product, but the source code is hidden because that application is commercial. So they won't be obviously giving you the source code to use for free because they use it to earn money. Whereas in case of the open source softwares, the application along with the source code itself is the whole product. Okay, so you are given the application to use. Along with that, you are also given access to the source code if you want to modify that application. So this is the basic difference between the two. At the same time, the license, there is some sort of license fee for proprietary software. If you want to get access to the source code of proprietary software, you are required to pay a certain fees, whereas in open source, it's all free. So yeah, but I must really clarify one thing, that even in the open source software, there is, license that is required. Also, you must have, heard about, or maybe you must have used yourself, different type of licenses that are available on GitHub. There is an MIT license and many other kind of licenses that specify which kind of permission you want to give for the other users, if they can use your code base, if they can modify it, or whatsoever. So in the same manner, an open source software has a specific set of license, whereas a proprietary software has a different license. So both of them do have a license. It's just that the difference is in the kind of specifications within that license, or the type of license that they have. The key fact that makes open source software different from proprietary is its license. As copyright material, the software is almost always licensed. The license indicates how the software may be used. The OSS is unique in that it is always released under a license that has been certified to meet the criteria of the open source definition. So, as I have already told you that OSS also have a software license, but there are specific things that are not found in the proprietary software, but they are present in OSS. So these are basically the four main points. Considering the first one, we redistribute the software without restriction. We are able to redistribute it without any sort of restriction. We can access the source code, we can modify the source code, and then we can also distribute the modified version of the source code, right? So these are the four different things that we are here to do, and I believe this is what makes OSS so special. So in contrast, the creators of the proprietary software usually do not make their source code available for others to modify because they're commercial, right? So obviously they're not going to give you the source code to use because they use it to earn the money. When considering the advantages of source code, open source software, you should consider the open source product itself, because as I have told you, the application along with the code is a product, that is given to you. Not only the application, but along with it, the source code is also a product in open source. Open source products vary in the quality. Definitely, there are a lot of open source which are premature, which are not completely functional in a perfect way, and there are a lot of them which have been there for since decades. So the older it gets, the better functionality it has, right? So OSS software does not come with phone support or maybe a personalized email support. This is something that you might have to pay for, because if you use that application for free, you won't be getting those personalized support, or you won't be getting those perks that you have when you pay for something, right? So if you want those perks along with that open source software, you might have to pay for those particular perks. However, there are commercial service providers who will provide the support. If you need a lot of support, consider whether the overall cost of using an open source will be higher than that of a proprietary product. So being a user, I think this is really important. If you're a user, you're not a developer for a moment and you're using this, you must also consider these things, because open source does not mean 100% free. There are going to be some problems that might also come in an open source. It is not maintained by an individual. It is something that is maintained by the whole group of developers. So there can be bugs, there can be some issues for you to understand, and there can be a lot of other stuff that might require some additional cost. Okay, so that's an important point to consider here. Open source software is unique in that it is always released under a license that allows users to access, modify, redistribute the source code. So we know this, right? Again, we have talked about it before, that source code is a specialized language that allows the software developers to create, modify computer programs. We know this, what exactly is source code. And if you don't have the permission to modify the source code and you don't have the license for it, then probably you cannot do anything with the source code. You can only use the application as a user. Now let's talk about the cost. Now, one thing I really want to make sure here is that you must not think that open source means 100% free. I've talked about it before, because some additional cost can be included in it, right? There can be times where you need to spend a bit of your money just to maintain it, or maybe to debug it, or maybe to get some support, So we need to keep in mind that while OSS is usually free, there are some exceptions. And they will usually be able to determine what these exceptions are by considering the total cost of ownership. That means the total amount of cost that we spend whenever we own the open source software as a user, not as a developer. So it is the cost involved in adopting, managing the OSS. While the software itself may be free, you can consider the additional services or additional products, as they may have some cost attached. For example, the support services or the access to the software updates and so on. You can also have to take in account the possible switching cost. Now, what is switching cost? Well, switching cost is usually considered when you have to switch your application from one operating system to another, or for example, you're moving from one PC to another. So just to make that software function properly in the new system, or maybe a new operating system in which you're switching, that cost required to maintain and to make that to make that application, OSS application, work properly in your new system, that cost is known as the switching cost. And I believe that switching cost is something we all must consider, because it's very common to switch laptops, or maybe to switch the operating systems. You might be using Linux, but then you switch to Windows or to Mac OS. So you need to consider those factors if you are a user. And we, being the developers, we need to understand this, because whenever we are developing an open source application, we must make sure that these things cost minimal to the user, and they have maximum profit out of our open source software, because that is the core essence. We made the open source application so that we can give back to the community, so that they don't have to pay for stuff that the proprietary software asks them to pay for. And this is the main reason why we should consider these points, know about them, and work accordingly. So these costs would include moving data from an old system to new system, training cost involved in switching from one platform to another, and for example, Windows to Linux operating system. If your business does not have enough information technology expertise, you may have to outsource the outside technical services to provide open source support, or to manage its implementation and its delivery. Okay, so enough with the proprietary software and the open source software. Like, now it's time to know a little bit about the history. Why does the open source start at first place? Because I think most of the software, not every, most of the software in today's time are paid, and in most of the cases we see there are some amazing open source softwares that sometimes perform even better than the softwares that are paid. So how does it all start? Because it does not seem to be something that just traditionally got started. There must have been some reason. So it's important for us being developers to know about it. So let's get started with it. So in 1970s, the proprietary software, that is, we have already talked about, the kind of software that did not allow the users to redistribute, modify, or access the source code, it became a norm. Almost everyone was making a proprietary software. And as far as I have heard and read about things, in 1970s, for most of the people, it was pretty expensive. The software or even the computer itself was pretty expensive to afford. They couldn't do it. And that was the reason why they had like big computers at one specific position. Like there was batch processing systems, and there were punch cards. So all these things were, under development stage. So at that time, when proprietary software came in, it made the lives harder. It did not ease anything, right? So the development of open source software was a reaction to the fact that the change or the improvement could not be made to proprietary software by other developer or users. And people were pretty frustrated at that point of time. They wanted to change the software, specifically the developers, but they couldn't do anything because they were not allowed to. So open source movement started with Richard Stallman's general public license model, which was in 1980s. And it holds that the software should be freely modifiable, with the condition that if you make improvement to the software, you must put the improvement back in the open source community. So this was the basic idea behind that open source movement, that if you are like making some sort of improvement, you must also give back to the open source community. And that's where it all started. So the rationale of for the open source movement is that larger group of programmers not concerned with proprietary ownership will produce a better product, because firstly, we will get tons of people who will be willing to contribute to open source. There will be tons of experts in different domains, and that will definitely give us an edge over, some specified group of people working on a particular software that does not even give them the freedom to work properly. Whereas in open source, you are free. You do not have any restriction. You can easily modify the source code according to your ease. You can add new features. You are not restricted in any possible manner. And that's how the developers will perform the best of their potential, right? So now let's talk about the business use case. Being a developers, we always develop the things that eradicate the real world problems, and this is our goal. So we must also firstly understand what exactly are the real world problems and how we are supposed to eradicate them. So most of the open source softwares are used in the businesses, especially the small scale business that do not have money to afford the proprietary softwares, their licenses, right? So I believe what we can learn from this whole use case is that we need to develop the open source softwares that ease the functioning or ease the usage for these small businesses. They have to make the least amount of modification, spend least amount of money, and they can like make best of their profit from these open source. So if you were to review the information on open source software, you will find that many different claims and counterclaims with respect to the advantages as well as to limitations. So it is quite obvious, right? There are always pros and cons. Some of the differing opinions arise from the fact that while an open source software package may not work very well in one business, it might not work so well in different environment. So I have already talked about it in our previous webinar that we had on Google Cloud, that if in any of the like we were talking there about IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. So we were discussing the same idea that there is nothing that is the best or there is nothing that's the worst. It only depends on the use case. It only depends on the requirement of the user, which one fits them or suits them in the best possible manner. The same thing is being discussed here, that many open source softwares are available, and some people say it's a good software, some say it's not a good software, probably because it does not fit their needs, you know. So you just cannot claim that any given software is best or worst. You just have to use it, or maybe you have to just check its functionality according to your requirements particularly. So we need to really assess what our business model needs. And the open source product we choose may have certain advantages of open source, and it can also have some sort of disadvantages. Whenever we are considering the advantages of the open source software, we should look at the open source product itself, because we know that the open source is a product itself. It's not that the open source is giving you the product, but the source code along with that application is in itself a big product, right? So there are a variety of open source software packages out there that range widely in terms of quality, and some of them are basically have been around longer than the others. For example, we have Linux, we have Apache, and we also have many Google's other open source softwares that have been in the market since long. So in the end, more mature products are likely to rate higher in terms of quality and reliability. It pays to do your homework when selecting the right software. So definitely, if you're a user, you need to do a little bit of homework according to your requirement, which particular software fits you the best, right? So as a small business, it's worthwhile to consider some of the open source options. You should consider all of them. You should try to figure out which one works best for you. Now let's talk about the advantages. So open source softwares definitely have their own set of pros and cons, but first of all, let's talk about the pros. So it has lower cost. Open source software usually do not require a license fee, and its lower cost is generally one of the key reasons why the small businesses choose to adopt this software. We have already talked about it. So we need to make sure that if we are a user, we need to make sure that the total cost of ownership when considering the open source software, and being a developer, we need to make sure that this cost is as minimum as much as it's possible. Then we have flexibility. They are pretty flexible, and a programmer can take the standard software package, modify it accordingly, and so that it suits the particular business in a much better way. We can usually hire a programmer to add a particular function to open source software. Then we have reliability and quality. So when we are looking at improved quality, we have to compare the products themselves, right? So it's possible to say that open source software is better than the proprietary softwares in terms of reliability and quality. And proprietary software is something you pay for. So they are definitely going to be more reliable. They're definitely going to have a better personalized support. And even if they get stuck, they will give a better servicing to the product since you have paid for it. But what if in open source you get stuck? You might get the services late. You might get them at some sort of fees, where you might have been expecting that it's completely free, because open source does not have a particular organization that works for it. There are different developers who collaborate and work for it. So it's a distributed kind of a system. You cannot blame a single person for it. You cannot expect a single person to respond to your needs. So this is the main difference. So sometimes they can be less reliable, and their quality can sometimes degrade. So mature open source software is generally viewed to be of good quality and reliability, because as and when the open source gets older, we get to know more about it. We get to know its pros and cons in much better way. And it's getting older, so we are like constantly working on it, improving it. So obviously it's going to be much better than those software which are very new in the market. If your business is not familiar with the open source software, you may only want to review some of the mature products, for example, Linux, Apache, and so on. So these are the products that have been there in the market since long. So yeah, then we have two more benefits of open source. The first one being it reduces the vendor lock-in period. So if we are using a proprietary software, we might be restricted to using certain vendors. Now, again, proprietary software led to the birth of open source softwares. People were pretty frustrated and they were trapped in this, that in proprietary software, they cannot modify things and so on. But in case of open source software, they're free to do. And yeah, even in the vendor lock-in case, in open source softwares, they might have some specific vendors, but they're not restricted completely, whereas in open source, they're completely restricted. For some open source products, there may be a limited number of vendors that can provide you with the services, upgrades, or security patches. But at the same time, if you're a developer yourself, I think that's not a big problem for you. Then we have availability of external support. So external technical support is available for many of the open source software packages. Some vendors offer support contracts, and there are service providers that install, configure, and maintain the OSS system. Many open source products also have active online community support, and they may be able to answer you, because whenever you are contributing to an open source community, they have their own set of mentors, or you can say helpers, that help you understand the code base, even if you're a developer or not. If you're a developer, they're going to help you even with the silliest things. Even if you ask them, they are just going to help you. And this is something beautiful about the open source community. So if you are a user and you're facing any bug, you can easily report it. Even on GitHub, there are most of the code bases lie in GitHub, right? So you must have seen that there is a specific section for issues. So you can easily report issues. You can easily make sure that your problems are heard, and you can communicate with the maintainers directly. So that's a great thing in open source. Now let's talk about some of the limitations. Now, every coin has two sides, and there are some of the advantages, but at the same time, there are some disadvantages as well. So the first one is the lack of personalized support. Unlike the proprietary softwares, OSS packages do not come with the phone support or the personalized email support. But as mentioned, there are commercial service providers who will provide support in terms of OSS. So if you need a lot of support, consider whether the overall cost of using an OSS product will be higher than that of a proprietary product, and accordingly you can choose between the two, right? Then you have restricted choice. Again, for an open source, you might not have a lot of choices, whereas in proprietary software, there are a lot of choices that may be given to you. Definitely, it has its own set of pros and cons in terms of proprietary software, but in terms of choice, I think since you are paying for a service, you will get more benefits out of it, definitely. So then we have speed of change. Software is being modified on an ongoing basis in open source world, which can make it difficult to ensure that the software is compatible with other applications or not. And again, the last point is no warranty. So open source softwares do not have any warranty because there is not a single company that's backing up the development. There are tons of developers or different organizations that are working to maintain them, right? They are distributed all over the world. So a single party or a single person cannot take the claim of that whole software. There are a lot of people continuously working towards it. So it is possible that if even one of them makes a single mistake, that can result in some bug or maybe some kind of blunder in the code base. Although nowadays we have pull request system where we can actually check the if that merging code is compatible or not, but still for specific user it can create a havoc, and it is possible. So hence we say that there is no warranty for the open source softwares. Now let's talk about freeware, free software, and shareware. So we have already talked about the open source and the proprietary softwares, but I think it's the time that we talk about these three as well, because being developers, we need to first understand what exactly their different kind of softwares are, and accordingly we can, work on them. Since open source, I think, requires our support, we need to give back to the community definitely, because even GDSC community is in itself an opportunity for us to learn. So hence it is our responsibility to give back to the software developers who work day and night just to maintain those softwares which we use. For example, we have OBS Studio. I've talked about it a couple of times. It is an open source software and we use it quite frequently to record videos and stuff. So again, it has really good quality and it does not even cost you a single penny. So it's really great to see such softwares flourish in the market and eradicate the real world problems that people face most of the times. So coming back to the freeware and free softwares, I will start with freeware. So freeware is a kind of software that is made available for the use by the author at no cost or for an unlimited time. So if you are using that software, you won't be charged any money. However, the author will retain the copyright of the source code. You won't be allowed to do anything with the software, and you won't be permitted by the author to change the code base or modify it and distribute it and so on. You will only be allowed to freely use it as a user. Okay, your use of software may be restricted to the personal use, individual use, non-profit use, non-commercial use, academic use, commercial use, or maybe a combination of all of them. But the crux is that you won't be given permission by the author to modify the source code. You will only remain a user in the freeware. Okay. After that, we have the free software. So free software is a kind of software that can be used to modify copied, redistributed, it can be modified, copied, or redistributed without any sort of restriction, and also for no cost at all. So free softwares, these type of softwares to be distributed as free software, the source code or the human readable form of the program must be made available to the recipient along with the free software license, releasing the source code to the public to allow for modification. So that's a great thing here. Free softwares allow us to modify the code, and as we have already have read out, that they need to provide some sort of license for doing the same. Free software is distinct from the freeware in that is not proprietary software and can be distributed freely. It should not be noted that some proprietary softwares are not compatible with free softwares, and such as those that depend on the user paying for a license in order to do lawfully use a software product. Now let's talk about shareware. So it's again a different type of software. It's a third type that we were going to talk about. Shareware is both a type of software and a way to distribute the software. So the authors of the shareware give users a license to try out the software for a specific period of time. It could be 30 days, 60 days, or anything, according to the author. But after that period ends, you need to pay for it to use it further. If you don't pay for it, then that clearly means you don't want to use that application anymore. So if a user wishes to continue to use that software after the trial period, he is required to register with the author by paying the author a small fee. Likewise, users may copy the shareware and pass it along to others, but they are too expected to pay a fee if they use the product beyond the 30-day trial period. So, however, if a user does not wish to continue using the software after the evaluation period lapses, he is expected to discontinue use of the product and erase the product files. Okay, so the shareware is distributed on the basis of an honor system. And in many of the cases, however, once the trial period ends, the shareware will have updates, and it will be required to the user to pay a small amount of fee for the additional functionality. Now let's talk about the pitfalls of using the freeware and the shareware. So we have already talked about their functionalities, their specifications, and what they allow, what they don't. But it's time to compare them and have some of their disadvantages right here. So there are mainly three pitfalls that we're going to talk about. The first one is they may contain virus, spyware particularly. So we all know what is spyware. It spies on our computer. It basically secretly sends information about our web surfing habits to its hacker's website. And I believe that we all must have antivirus softwares, but sometimes these viruses are so cleverly developed, they even ditch our antivirus softwares. So there is always a risk of getting a spyware in your system if you use the freeware and the shareware. So be careful. The next thing is some shareware and freeware programs do not have an uninstall feature. Now, you being the developers might think it's not that big of a problem, but for a user, it is really big problem. Someone who does not know how to program, who is not that much familiar with the internal functioning of the system, will definitely face a lot of trouble whenever they want to uninstall them. So it becomes difficult for them to handle it, and they are like difficult to get rid of for a layman, right? There may be lack of technical support. If you have any questions about a particular shareware or a free program, there might not be technical support always available for you. So again, this is a big pitfall. So now let's talk about the Google open source, and I would like to pay attention here. I would like to focus on the fact that Google itself have a lot of different kind of programs, GSOD and GSOC. I'll be talking about two of them. Apart from Google, there are some other programs as well, which are sponsored by some other companies. I'll also give you a brief introduction about them. And let's get started. So Google has a lot of open source projects under its umbrella, as you can see here. Android it itself is an open source software. It's an operating system for a wide range of devices, and this is really amazing. So there are a lot of other softwares as well. For example, AdaNet, or you can say AMP project, Abseil, Angular, and so on. Then you have many programming languages as well, which are open source. For example, Go. Go is an open source programming language, and we all have heard about it, right? So it's such an amazing thing that Google keeps these essential softwares open source. And we use Android a lot. In fact, every mobile runs on Android nowadays. So most of the people use it, and in fact half of the population use it. So it's really great to see such open source softwares flourish in the market and then eradicate the real world problems. We being the developers must try to do the same in our future, to develop some open source softwares and just let people use it to the best of their capabilities. Now we have some of the open source programs, and here we are going to talk about Google Summer of Code and Google Season of Docs. And these two programs are pretty famous worldwide. These are really beneficial for your resume building as well. And if in case you get selected in them, then they definitely give you a really great opportunity to get good exposure, contribute to different projects, and collaborate with the experts and developers from across the globe. So there is a great learning opportunity hidden in here. Firstly, let's talk about GSOC. You all must have heard about the name, at least if you don't know the details. I'll formally read about the details that were available on the internet, and then I'll try to explain you why is it there, why is it very important, and why I would encourage anyone to at least apply in it. So Google Summer of Code program is a program started by Google, and it has completed 16 years already. So that's amazing. It is a program that aims to promote open source software development among university students. And there are a few organizations that have their mentors. And first, the organization apply to Google. After the organizations are selected by Google, then the students apply to those organizations to contribute to them. Okay, so bear in mind that you're not an employee of Google if you get selected in GSOC, neither you are an intern. You are working with that organization to which you applied to contribute, and you will be given a stipend which will be funded by Google. Is that clear? Right? So stipend is usually 1500 USD or something. So the timeline is usually between January to August, and most of the people start contributing from January onwards. I particularly believe it is really beneficial for university students or budding technocrats who want to have really great careers in technology, because first point is it gives you the team spirit. You learn to work in teams, you learn to collaborate. And I believe in industry you won't be getting any projects where you will be working all alone. You will be getting projects where you will be required to work all together with thousands of other developers. So it's really important for all of us to learn that skill as soon as we can, because it's going to help us in the future. Moreover, we must have the habit of understanding the code base, or specific functions or implementations of specific features that are implemented by different coders, because this is again a big skill to understand the code written by someone else. And as soon as you learn to do this, you will be in benefit. You have to do that anyways in the future. So this is an amazing opportunity, and you don't only connect with people from India or people from your city. You connect with people from all over the world. You get mentors from different fields internationally. You get different kind of exposure that you cannot get from any other thing, right? So it's really amazing. And at least even if you don't get selected, you will learn how to contribute, how to collaborate, and you will have some really amazing mentors who might offer you some other options, in your career, or maybe give you some other opportunities if they are really impressed with your hard work. So there, I think there is like no disadvantage in trying and applying to this program, since I can only see that there is advantages, a lot of perks involved in GSOC. Even if you don't get selected, you learn a lot, you gain many other opportunities. So why not try for it? I would encourage all of you to at least try this year. So then we have GSOD, that is the Google Season of Docs. So one thing that an open source project cannot get enough of is good documentation. So however, Google Season of Docs is a new program by Google where the technical writers and open source organization come together and they work on open source projects. Technical writers write documentation for the open source organization, and then they're paid by Google. It is worthwhile platform for students to learn from industry experts and to work for an open source project. Also, you need to remember that you must be aged between 18 or more at the time of registration to become eligible for the Google Season of Docs. So in my personal point of view, a documentation is super important, because if any of the code base has a really great documentation, which is detailed, which explains the purpose of that application, which definitely explains, sometimes the key functionalities being implemented, it becomes easier for developers to understand the code base. And at the same time, if any organization have a messy or does not have a documentation at all, it is super hectic for a developer to understand the code base or the reason for that application. You will have to ask your mentors again and again and stuff. So I think documentation is the key foundation for any open source organization's project, and this is the reason why there is a specific program for the same. So if any of the students who feel they might not be interested in the technical roles, or you have your friends, I would encourage you to share this opportunity with them. They can contribute as a technical writer and improve the documentation of different organizations and help the open source community thrive. So I think we have reached almost the end of our webinar, and this is the time where I would like to get some question and answers from you all. So if you have any question answers, feel free to write them in the chat section and I will be checking out on them. All right. So I can see a few of the questions here. The first question is asked by Aparna Sinha, our core team member. So see, she is saying, how does someone get involved in an open source community? So, okay, I have already talked about it, but this was with respect to the Google programs. If in case you are a complete beginner and you want to get involved in open source, I believe that you first of all need to have a GitHub account. You'll need to learn how to use GitHub, if not Git. Git is command line particularly, but GitHub is fairly easy to use. It's an web user interface. So therein you can search for different organizations. I know many of them personally. So I would recommend you to first of all search for them yourself, because that will help you get a personalized, that selection list, curated list of organizations according to the technology you're familiar with, or maybe according to uh, a particular kind of tech stack you want to work with. And accordingly you can choose an organization, and you can then contact the maintainers, or maybe start to read the documentation and then the code base. That will give you a brief understanding of what that application is all about. After you're done with all of that, you can start either contributing that to that code base by opening a pull request, or if you do not feel comfortable enough, you can contact the maintainers. Now usually the maintainers can be contacted via that GitHub section. Otherwise, each and every organization have some source of communication, maybe via Discord, or maybe via Slack or anything as such. You need to figure that out yourself according to that particular organization, and you can get in touch with the maintainers, ask them that you're a fresher, or you want to contribute in this tech stack, and they will definitely help you out, figure it out. So I think this is the best way through which you can start exploring at least the open source. And when you feel comfortable enough, you can start to contribute for open source Google Summer of Code as well. So yeah, that's it. So I'm reading other questions. I can see one more question here. Okay. So Samriddhi is asking us, how can an organization get involved in an open source community? Okay. So, okay, the organization themselves, basically, there are a lot of different type of organization. Firstly, if it is a proprietary organization that supports the proprietary software or something, and they want to become open source, they have to change the licenses and the stuff. But if you are referring as an organization to a group of people who want to contribute to open source, I would say the same procedure as I told before. And talking about the organization themselves, they have a lot of different ways to flourish their open source projects. They can participate in Google Summer of Code itself, because initial phase of Google Summer of Code involves the different organizations sending their proposal to Google as just to participate in GSOC. Google accepts or rejects them. After that, they are shortlisted. Those organizations are available, and we, the students, after that, reach out to those organizations in order to contribute. Okay, so if an organization particularly wants to get some help from the open source community, I think this is one of the best ways to get some help, because here the students are actually really enthusiastic. So they get better results than ever. That's why even after 16 years, Google Summer of Code is successfully running each and every year. And in coming year 2022, again, it will come back with really great spirits and enthusiasm virtually. So I really encourage you all to at least participate in it and try your luck and just do your best. So that's all. I think that was all. And I would like to thank you all for joining the webinar. I really hope you took away a lot of information and understanding from it, and that you implement it in your day-to-day life and start to contribute to open source as a developer, just to hone your skills and become the best technocrat. Because remember, we have to set a legacy for the coming batches. So I just need your cooperation. You are my community, and we all are working together as a team. And I really hope that we make a difference. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.